Hi everyone, it's me again, Adam, the Quality Improvement Practitioner here at ESHT, and this is the fourth and somewhat delayed next mini module in QI. So in this one, I'm going to talk about demand and capacity, and demand and capacity is the term that we use to refer to all of the methods that we use to look at the demand for particular types of care and the need for treatment that's coming into our organisation, and the capacity in terms of resources that we have to meet that need, the staffing, the materials, the technology, everything that we need to treat those patients and deliver care. And I'm also going to talk about, once we've got that information and we've understood it in a standardized best practice way, what decisions can we then make about how to improve those problems and perhaps find greater efficiencies and deliver more to patients. So I would emphasise that this is one of the more technical elements of quality improvement. There's a lot more that you can learn. I hope that this video will provide people with an introduction that will get you thinking and perhaps get you interested in wanting to learn more, and you might then go out and do some demand and capacity work in your own areas. So let's get into the module.
So let's begin by looking at some of the key terminology which you need to use when looking at demand and capacity. So our demand is all of the requests for the type of care that we provide that come in from all different sources. So this might be a number of different sources of referrals that are incoming, or it could, for example, be some combination of planned care and emergency or unplanned walk-in appointments. But the key thing is that demand is all of the treatment that's being requested, not just the ones that we're able to see. So now let's look at capacity. Our capacity is all of the resource that we have which is actually available to deliver care. So for instance, we might have 3 beds, but we need a nurse to deliver care in each bed, and we've only got 2 nurses. So in that example, our capacity is 2 beds and the amount of nursing time available at each of them. So capacity is defined as the maximum amount of treatment that you can provide if it's fully utilised. So we can see now that some very sick looking patients are coming into our beds, and that enables us to measure our activity level. So activity is the amount of treatment, the amount of care that we actually provided. How many patients did we see and how long did it take us to provide that treatment to them? So we can imagine that each time a patient finishes their appointment in our clinic and is discharged, the time that took is added to our overall activity level. Now, unfortunately, we're not always able to meet all of the demand all of the time, so requests or referrals for treatment that we're not able to meet will become our waiting list or people in a waiting room, and that's what we would call the backlog. Now, when we come to actually measure these factors, the key thing that we need to do in order to be able to actually interpret that information is to use a common unit of measurement. So if you were to imagine that you were running a shop and your sales prices were in euros, but your profits were recorded in pounds and your overhead expenditure was in dollars, it would be very confusing to tell if you were running your shop well or not. Well, similarly, if you're running a healthcare service, if your demand is being measured in terms of referrals coming in and your capacity is measured in numbers of staff available each day, and your activity levels are recorded in number of clinic appointments delivered, those are all different units of measurement. So the best practice approach to this is to record all of these factors in minutes. So for example, a referral in might become 20 or 30 minutes of demand because we know that that's the average time that it takes to treat a patient. And a member of staff who's available for a day with all of the equipment that they need to deliver care becomes 300, 400 minutes of staffing capacity. So now that we have all of these factors plotted on the same chart, we can begin to get an understanding of what's going on in our service. So we might be able to see things like, is our demand consistently higher than our capacity? Is our backlog increasing? Or are any of these factors fluctuating in an unusual way? And these observations can then inform the actions that we take. So let's begin looking at how we might use this information to make some changes. Let's imagine that we have a service in which we see an average of 2 or 3 patients per day. And so you might conclude that the correct amount of capacity to provide to meet that demand is the average, which in this case would be around 2.5. However, if you look at what happens on the chart here, on the days when there are more than 2.5 units of demand, we see that that creates an unmet demand, which goes into our backlog and forms a queue. Unfortunately, on the days when we do have spare capacity and the demand is lower, there's nothing that we can do to meet the demand that we didn't see on previous days, and so it continues to increase. So in this instance, the best practice approach is to set your capacity at 80% of the variability in demand. So that would mean, in other words, that if you think of the most demand that you would get on the highest level of demand, 20% less than that is where you should be setting your capacity level at. And what you can see in this version of the chart is that only very occasionally will our demand be above the capacity that we have available, meaning that we never have an unmanageable queue developing. Now, I should acknowledge that this is a best case scenario example because we wouldn't always or usually have spare capacity to set our capacity level exactly where we want it. But if, for instance, you're designing a new service or you're setting a target for where you think you need to be once you've found efficiencies, that 80% of variability rule is what you should be aiming for. So let's begin to think about some of the ways that you might find more capacity by improving a service. So the starting point would be to look at all of the steps in the process that a patient might move through as they come into your service. In this example, we've got a number of steps in the pathway: triage, blood test, an x-ray, seeing a clinician, and then going into the pharmacy. Now, we would want to think about where should we start our work to find extra capacity or to improve efficiency. Well, let's look at how our patients move through this process. There's plenty of capacity at triage, so they all move through that fairly rapidly. Fewer get past the blood test because there isn't quite as much capacity, and then there's enough for those three to move through the x-ray and seeing a doctor fairly smoothly. But then at the final step of the pharmacy, only one patient's able to move through. What this means is that if we made our improvement efforts on one of the earlier steps, for example, the hematology step, it wouldn't result in any improvement to the number of patients actually moving through our process and thereby increasing our capacity, because they would all still get stuck at the bottleneck at the end, which is our pharmacy. This is known as the rule of constraints, which is that when you are looking for improvements in capacity, you should focus first on the point in your process or pathway where capacity is most constrained, because otherwise you won't make an overall improvement. So where do we find these improvements in capacity? Well, there are a number of different approaches to this, most of which are beyond the scope of this video, but let's look at one example which I think is quite relevant and useful: pooling of resources. So let's use an analogy here that might be familiar to a lot of people. So if you've ever ordered a takeaway, you might have used one of the many apps that are now popular that allow you to choose from different restaurants. And you may have wondered, why is it better for a restaurant to use an app they have to pay to be on it rather than having their own driver? Well, let's look at the animation here. Our driver, coming from one restaurant, heads out to collect orders, but he has to collect them as and when they arise. And that could result in taking quite an inefficient route. Perhaps he's just arrived back at the restaurant and goes straight back to where he's come from and makes a long circuitous journey because he can't anticipate where the orders are going to be. But now let's consider if all of those restaurants pooled their resources by being part of a centralised app, which is taking all of the orders and then sending them to a group of drivers who aren't working for any one restaurant but are going to each order as it comes up. Well, now you can see, as these little moped men start moving, that they can take much more efficient routes because they arrive at the order which is closest to them, regardless of which restaurant the order has been placed with. So the exact same principle can be applied when designing NHS services. So for instance, during the COVID period, something that some GPs practices did in order to meet the much increased demand that they were facing was to do away with each GP seeing the same group of patients, and a patient calling in for an appointment would see the first GP who was available. So they pooled their resources in order to ensure that somebody who was wanting an appointment would definitely be able to see a doctor. Now, clearly, pooling resources isn't always the right solution in a healthcare context, because sometimes continuity of care is more important than increasing capacity. However, what we do tend to see is that this approach is often overlooked in situations where it would work and be helpful.
Okay, so I hope you found that useful. Something that I think is worth saying is that demand and capacity methods are probably more relevant than ever at the moment, as we're in the period of recovering from the COVID pandemic. So a lot of the things that we do as an organisation and within our teams have changed since pre-pandemic. We have new teams and services that didn't previously exist. All of us are using technology in different ways, including to deliver care, and our existing teams have often changed the way that they're structured and how they're delivering their services. So all of those kinds of changes are things that we might want to be using these methods that I briefly described, demand and capacity analysis, to understand what's changed. Have those changes been helpful? How have they affected what we're doing and the outcomes that we're getting? And in particular, there are an awful lot of opportunities that might arise out of those changes, and where things have been improved as a result and perhaps have been more efficient, more effective. This is a really great way of generating evidence and understanding of what's going on, so that you can kind of share and spread that learning. So, as I said at the beginning, this was just a fairly brief intro. There's an awful lot more that you can learn about demand and capacity. If people want to find out more, I would encourage you to contact me directly via the usual email address. There's also a range of resources out there that you can access from NHS Learning, or we hope to be putting on some classroom-based training around these advanced QI techniques at some point in 2022, so watch this space and there may be something coming out this year. Other than that, thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you in the next module.